Well, thanks for having me. I just heard the word Debbie Downer, so we're going to try to up the enthusiasm. So Jessica is with us from Verily, which is the formerly of Google X and then Google Life Sciences, sits under the Alphabet umbrella. And you joined, you were previously practicing medicine and a top cardiologist. Can you talk about why you decided to make that shift over to a tech company that's not traditionally associated with healthcare?
So thank you for welcoming both of us to this panel. And I think that question really gets at the core of what we heard in the earlier panel discussion. Where do we see technology and healthcare coming together? So as mentioned, I practice cardiology. I predominantly practice critical care cardiology, so people who come in with acute heart attacks. And we've been using technology for years. So we would use things like percutaneous left ventricular assist devices. But what became quite clear to me is that much of the technology is starting to move outside of the four walls of the hospital. And we heard in the panel, what is this going to mean as technology interfaces with patients and people, what I like to call in the real world. And one thing that became very critical as I started to visit Google was this serious commitment to understanding people in the world. What actually makes people get up every day? What motivates people? How can we give people positive associations to help change behavior? And so I ended up joining and left a pretty, I would say, traditional academic medical path because I think physicians need to be at the table, patients need to be at the table with these technology companies. And it has been an amazingly exciting and wild ride. But it's something where if we're not at the table, this is happening. And it has been really exciting to sit side by side with amazing software and hardware engineers and envision not only healthcare today, but where we're going in the future.
We were just talking earlier about sort of how you see your role at Verily, and you mentioned the phrase getting back to the basics, and you sort of juxtaposed that with some of the really sexy technology that we associate with the Valley, things like VR and AI, but what you're interested in is sort of baseline health and behavior. Can you speak a little bit about that and on the baseline health project that you're working on?
So there are two things that we try to do. One is to figure out what are the issues that we're facing today. And even in the conversation we heard this morning, just having portable medical information is something that needs to be tackled. So we can come up with amazing algorithms and working with the world's best machine learning analysts. But unless we can aggregate that data and make it accessible and valuable to patients and providers, we're not going to be able to use all of these tools and technologies that have entirely revamped how we communicate on a day-to-day basis. So we have to understand our basic technology issues in healthcare. We also have to understand basic biology. I think we've done a nice job in the community to understand, we've pushed the boundaries. In my life prior, I ran our genetics unit for a clinical trials group, and we have done amazing work as a community in genetics, but I think we've only hit the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. So it's this idea of really establishing where are we now, and then thinking about where's the puck going. I like the comment there, but we do have to take care of some of today's problems as well.
I really like what you said about kind of we need to fix some of the most basic stuff before we can bring in kind of the advanced technologies, or perhaps we can do it at the same time. But the sort of unsexy stuff, like making sure we can transfer a medical record from one facility to another, is not something that's talked about quite as often, but it's so important before we start bringing in kind of the troops to completely reframe healthcare.
Yeah, I think about it a bit like building a house, right? You have the foundation in place. I think everyone in this room is working to make sure that we have that really solid foundation. But then what are the different tools and accessories that we need to really make this house a place that we want to live? And so we do have a relatively large group of individuals thinking about the next generation of incredibly small disposable electronics that are biocompatible. And that's really exciting. I think it will totally transform. We think about digital health as a wearable or something physical, but if we start to instrument buttons, things that we use every single day, that's where we're going to be going, and that's where we'll meet people in their day-to-day life. But we've got to get the foundation, and then we build the house.
Yeah, it's in covering sort of Verily over the last year or so, I've noticed that it's just been a constant stream of partnerships with the broader life sciences community, one after another, as you tackle disease areas like diabetes. Seems to be a big area of focus. Can you talk about why Verily decided to take that partnership-driven approach?
So there's some things at Verily that are probably best suited entirely within the organization. And what's been fun about Verily is we get to tap into a lot of the core infrastructure of Google. And we can talk more about that if that's of interest, but really bring it into a dedicated healthcare and life science space. But I think everyone in the room can attest to the fact that healthcare is hard and biology is challenging. And if we want to do things at an accelerated time frame, then it's really helpful to figure out partnerships that are strategic to get us to have tools for patients and providers as soon as possible. And so you alluded to our commitment to diabetes, and we've met with many patients, and you hear the real needs. And so for us, partnering with a group like Dexcom that has a continuous glucose monitor that's available, it has some really excellent features, but then bringing that capability with all of these incredibly small electronics I talked about felt like a really wonderful, I'll call it a marriage, a really wonderful partnership that is incredibly deep so that we can accelerate timelines.
Can you talk a little bit about the contact lens?
Sure. So the contact lens, it's a project that I think you mentioned when I first joined, we were part of Google X. Google X was this research and development arm from Google, really thinking about the latest information issues and thinking how can we address them. And the contact lens has an incredibly small sensor that can sense glucose. It also has all of the power circuits and the connectivity, right? So you don't want to have to wear a contact lens or wear a gadget and then have to hold another gadget up to it in a very close proximity. But it's this idea of thinking about new technologies that can actually sit on the eye, something that can sit in the body and give us information and make it meaningful to a person. So we, as a cardiologist, I might say, you know, I know you have diabetes, and I really want you to get your glucose under control, because in 20 years, you may have problems with your heart, your kidneys, your vessels. But that is really in the future. This idea that if we can get information, if it's glucose, if it's other analytes to people in the moment, we may be able to have a moment where someone can change that behavior. So it's been a really exciting project, and it's actually the technology has led to a host of other projects. I think that's something else. People in the room who are working in this field and really are technologists, no project or entity lives on its own. It always leads to downstream really interesting consequences.
And I've seen, you know, there've been a slew of sort of interesting projects in the medical device side, and, you know, the contact lens is one of them. And I'm going to be a downer again, but the sort of cycle for this, it's 10 years. It takes a very long time to get this stuff to the clinical market. Is a company like Google, though, is associated with kind of rapid innovation. Has that been a challenge from a culture perspective when your team is saying, look, we need to be patient, this is going to take time, it might not even work? And a Google is sort of used to things being quite rapid and being able to test them quickly.
So scientific rigor, regulatory rigor are front and center. And I think you're spot on in making sure that we really understand the landscape. With that being said, our approach has been, let's think about areas where we think we can be a bit innovative, and let's create an environment and an ecosystem. So you brought up diabetes. Let's create a platform where we can bring the best tools and technologies, integrate them. Some of them may be tools that are already out there, but it's hard to access the information and make it meaningful. Other really future-oriented tools may take 10 years to integrate into this platform. So start now, bring the best that we have, but always have an eye on where are we going, where is the healthcare system going. I was really inspired by the talk this morning, thinking about new incentives, the idea that we can think about population health, but let's create a platform which starts in the near future, but it has a huge tail, and actually our work will never be done if we think about it that way.
One of the things we talked about earlier was Google Health, which you mentioned was sort of ahead of its time, but ended up shutting down a number of years ago, and it was a PHR technology, if anyone remembers it. What are the sort of, I know this is ahead of your time, you weren't at Google then, but have there been any lessons that seem to have been sort of incorporated into what Verily is doing from that Google Health project, which was probably a lot harder than people might have envisioned?
You hit on it in the last statement around having a vision, knowing where you're going, and being committed to it. And Google Health was a way of organizing patients' information, trying to have patients be able to port their data. I think the idea is now something for people in the room who talk about PHR and patient health records. This is something that is, I think, of great interest. We also have to make it easier for people and providers. So the idea that someone's going to have to be responsible for uploading all their information, I think that there's too much friction there. The Blue Button initiative that was started through a regulatory initiative, I think was a great first step to try to make information more obtainable. But I do think when you're trying something hard, you have to have fortitude to continue to do it. So I think the lessons are understand the timelines, try to take the friction out of the process, and not be scared. If you feel like you're on the right path and you're doing something that's meaningful, do everything you can to continue it.
Yep, and to that point, one of the things I hear a lot about kind of as a journalist covering the space is sort of the new intersection that we're seeing between engineers on the one hand and sort of folks in the clinical world on the other, and the sort of importance of these two groups coming together. You definitely see that at Verily. It's like a microcosm of that trend. What's it been like from a kind of cultural perspective to see these two groups having to work together?
So it's been fascinating, and again, I'm sure many people in the room have had this experience. So on one hand, in order, for example, to be a cardiologist, it's 4 years of medical school and 3 years of residency, and it was 4 years of fellowship and then a research fellowship and then being on faculty. And at that point, you start to think, I think I know a little bit about medicine. But to be able to take that approach and really know that what you're bringing in terms of understanding patients, understanding health, bringing that to the table, being really vocal as an advocate for patients and providers is so important. But then you have to be pretty open. I've had to be very open when someone says, but why are you doing things that way? Instead of just saying, well, that's the way I was trained. When questions come up and they're good ones, to really be open to that and to swim a little bit in the ambiguity and then come up with the next best solution. So it's been, I think it is a microcosm of what we're seeing more globally, but I have been mentally challenged a ton in the last year and a half, and it's turned out to be an incredibly positive thing.
Would you recommend even like a tour of duty or something for clinicians to have some experiences at these companies? And I say this because I did a story for NPR last year called Dropout Docs. There's a group in San Francisco with that name, and they meet regularly. And these are people who left clinical medicine to go work at startups. And after that piece, I got, for months, just emails from young doctors saying, you know, oh my goodness, this is so challenging. Is there another industry that I should be working in? So I wonder if there's been, you know, benefit for you in sort of taking a brief kind of break from the clinical world to explore kind of these other types of industries, especially the tech industry. And would you recommend other doctors do the same?
So I think this is a great idea. And I would even say it should be a two-way exchange. We should be opening up a lot of our healthcare initiatives to people who are really trying to bring the solutions to the table. Because if you understand, and this is something Google talks a lot about, I've learned a lot about, if you understand your user, is your user a patient, is it a physician, then the products that you create will be much more beneficial. And I do think physicians and healthcare providers really benefit a lot when they see the world through people who are trying to create those solutions. And I will comment, when your article came out, as you can imagine, I get a lot of phone calls, I meet with a lot of people, there's always a lot of career angst in the world. And I think for the right people, having a brief stint in medicine and then going over to technology totally makes sense. On the other hand, I spend as much time talking with folks saying, the medical training takes a while, but when you become someone who can have a seat at the table, who has domain knowledge, and you truly feel it, you know what it's like to treat a patient, there's a lot of value there as well. And so I thank you for the article. It's prompted a lot of interesting discussion.
I'm glad you've given some pep talks out of it.
Oh yeah, I'm like, no, healthcare is amazing. Being a physician, I think it's a really, it's an amazing career, the fact that patients let you into their lives. And maybe I saw it through the lens of, in my practice, as I mentioned, dealing in cardiac critical care, you're with people at the very end of their life, and sometimes you're the last person they see, and I think there's no bigger privilege than that. So but I will say your article definitely got people talking.
I like the idea of the career swap. Maybe someone from this conference can make that happen.
Yeah, and we do have a program.
Jessica, let me interrupt for a second. You know, it's funny when medical students come spend a year with us, we're worried about them not wanting to finish medical school or train. It's because it's, you know, the stuff is a little bit cracky in that sense. You want to stay on it because it feels so disruptive. But I have a question about the data problem. So Google is known for Your brilliant data analytics, your ruthless efficiency, all the strengths of your company and your ability to understand its users and to monetize that, one of the most successful companies in the world. When you think about medical data and the potential for discovery of what you guys know, you're years ahead of anybody else, right? Maybe not Amazon, but pretty close, or maybe more. So you can't, maybe two companies in the world really do this well. It's tricky with medical data. I know there are privacy issues, but there's the potential for so much discovery. How do you think about it, and how do you advise the greater Google around just their current business model versus what it'll be in medicine versus their ability to really, help discover great things for health?
Yep. So one aspect is really a technology-related question, and what I've seen that's really encouraging is the way a company like Google builds software. It's parallel. So they build, you might have, if you think about it, there's 7 different products that Google has that touch it over 1 billion users a day. And the backbone of that is shared. The backbone between Gmail, Maps, it's not that the information is shared, it's quite, there are a lot of access controls, but being able to tap into that, because healthcare data is equally rich and complicated, and we need to have platforms and tools that help all of us in the room access it. So I would say from a technology perspective, there's huge amounts of potential. One of our lead engineers who's working on our data platform worked on Maps for many years, another place that has very complicated information that needs to be delivered in real time. So that's the technology answer. I think you hit on an equally interesting and important question in how do we bring people along so that they feel that they want to be part of this initiative. And we have to make sure there's privacy. And the other thing, there has to be value. The reason people trust and use a lot of technologies is they get value out of that technology. So this amorphous, we're just going to study data in a black box and not provide value is not the right way. So I think a great question, and it's, we're tackling it in those 2 ways.
And to piggyback off of that question, can you talk a little bit about the baseline study?
So what we generally have done at Verily, we see it as 3 main things, and it's hitting both of these questions. One is, how do you collect information, whether it's molecular information, digital information? So how do you collect it, organize it, and then translate it into value? And one thing that became clear is that we now have the capacity to analyze and integrate data in a way that we just couldn't do 5 years, 10 years down the road. And there have been amazing epidemiologic studies, but not with the ability to gather large sums of data and integrate it. So the baseline study is really trying to get an understanding of molecular, digital, imaging data, and just understand what is going on at a deep molecular and imaging level so that we understand the baseline. Because once we understand what it means to be human, once we understand human systems biology, I think people in the room can use this data, and this is going to ultimately be a public data access repository, but you can use this data to create the next tools and technologies. So that is what we're doing with baseline, and then it's going to help build the next generation of platforms so that we can actually integrate data. And I think the introduction this morning, where we saw a lot of different devices, we have got to figure out how to integrate that information. There's a lot of, if you're getting raw waveforms, you really need to figure out how to make it meaningful, because doctors and patients don't just want a lot more data, they want it organized.
So you're trying to get data from within the medical system, and then on top of that, data that's collected by the patient, and mix it all together and then form kind of larger insights?
Yes, and the idea that if we understand baseline, if we understand the variability in baseline, we will have a much richer understanding. As we see a medical signal, we'll say, is that a normal signal, or is that actually a harbinger of something that's abnormal? And we have to have that differentiator, because this idea that you're healthy until you're sick is really arbitrary. It's very black and white. There's likely this whole continuum. And the more we think about that and understand that continuum, I think the more proactive we can be with health and disease.
And are you recruiting patients for this actively?
So we've conducted a separate pilot, and we're now in the stages of really finalizing what's the right information. We work with many health institutions, we work with patients. We're really trying to make sure that we provide something that is of global interest. And going back to this concept of value, what is the healthcare community ultimately going to value?
And what do you think, it's hard to say of all these sort of various data sources that you're collecting, but is there one in particular that you've had access to that you really don't see anywhere else that you're finding to be quite rich?
So I have worked in the past with a lot of genomics data, and I think I will continue to say that there is interest in deep omics profiling. The other area, and this conference is really pushing the limits, but this idea of understanding sensors and sensors broadly. So I think many people think about wearables. As a cardiologist, I always think about the cardiac monitoring. But this idea, for example, in the space of neurology, understanding someone's tremor, understanding that if someone gets a therapy, how do you measure that tremor? So what I'm seeing is a real push in terms of incredibly small sensors that give biologic information that can be actionable. And I do think the depth of data there is something we're working with companies that can integrate all that becomes important.
So you mentioned earlier that you were thinking at some point in the next few years of going back into practice. Is there anything that when you resume practicing that you will do differently, having had this experience?
So the hope, I practiced for many years. I am planning to continue to practice. For those of you who have tried to get a medical license in California, it takes a little bit of time, but I got my license, which is great. I think the pieces that I will take with me is that there, and I knew this before, but there is a world outside that moment when I see a patient within the four walls of either a hospital or a clinic. And if I can be a small part of helping provide any tools to empower people to take, I think most people really do want to do the right thing medically and for their health, but if I can think about people not only in that interaction that I have, but how can I help that patient outside? Is it give them glucose information so that they're empowered to make the right dietary choices, or making medication adherence a little bit easier? So I will take a much more comprehensive view of health.
And so that means if a patient walks in with their AliveCore or another device that they've been using, that you're going to try to sort of look into that information, because I think there's been some confusion and debate among whether or not necessarily with a medical grade technology, but with a pure consumer technology that for say something like step counts, whether that information should be brought into kind of the doctor-patient relationship.
There are the medical grade, and I think we called it this morning, diagnostic grade devices that will help us make very actionable decisions very quickly and shorten the time lag. And then we have to figure out the right way to bring consumer data in. And it may be in a more qualitative way, but if it is helping people make a meaningful difference in their life, then it's something that we need to be open to.
So we have to wrap up, but can you give us a final sentence on just what is Verily's mission?
Sure. I alluded to it earlier, but I think it's very important to walk away with this concept that we believe that there are a lot of sources of information that we need to start collecting, organizing, and then translating and bringing value to patients. And we have to think about the long goal. We have to think about where is healthcare going and how do we give tools that help add value in the long term. And we look forward, I think you also heard, we partner a great deal and we want to be on this mission with like-minded individuals. So we're collecting, organizing, and translating with some of the world's best partners.
Well, thank you so much. It was really fun.
Thank you.